Welcome, everyone. I am as delighted and excited as I can be to launch this brand new series of RSI Remote Simultaneous Interpreting Webinars. I am Marjorie Bancroft, founder and director of Cross-Cultural Communications. We're the only U.S. national training agency for community and medical interpreting. We just completed a wildly successful webinar series, successful beyond our wildest dreams actually, on OPI and VRI. This series is 4 webinars, starting today with an overview all about remote simultaneous interpreting, RSI. And just as a quick note, there's a little bit of housekeeping. The CUs are only for CCHI and ATA. We did request CUs for NBCMI. We have not heard back. If you are looking for certificates, please, no need to request them anymore. We have automated that. So within 24 hours, you will get an email with a link to your certificate. Without further ado, I want to introduce the amazing Katty Kaufman. You're in for a treat. This lady, not only is she a member of AIC, she will be explaining what AIC is and TALS. She's interpreted, oh my gosh, for on every, well, not on every RSI platform, but on RSI platforms that are the big ones. She has tested, I think, all of the others that she hasn't been on. She has interpreted for presidential assemblies and Organization of American States and all the things that you can imagine. And she's here with us today. So she will introduce herself in more detail, but I am going to hand the baton over and listen with glee. Enjoy, everyone.
Thank you, Marjorie. Thank you so much for that very kind and generous introduction. And thank you to everyone who is with us today. I see that we are now at over 700 people, and I am honored to have that many people listening to just little me. Really, I'm quite amazed. Let me go ahead. I do have a PowerPoint that I want to share with you. I'm hoping to spend some time, obviously, with your Q&A. I know that there have already been some questions posed. So without further ado, let me go ahead and get started on this, and hopefully everything will work. Zoom did an update yesterday, and it is right. So there we go. Right. Hang on. User error, as usual. You're seeing the entire presentation as I go through this. So basically you don't have to actually listen. There you go. All right. Let's see if we can take it from the actual top. There we go, hopefully. All right. I am trusting that this is now working. All right. My apologies. I have worked on Zoom, but I don't speak on Zoom all that often. Okay, so as we know, the topic of the day is let's do RSI. In the original announcement, there were a bunch of exclamation points. And rather than an exclamation, I'm hoping that this will be more of a conversation and more of a series of questions. So what will we be talking about today? I'll be talking about what conference interpreting is, what it isn't, what RSI is, what RSI isn't, and a little bit about where we go from here. Now, Marjorie introduced me very briefly, but we can say this. I've spoken in the physical world fairly often. I've had the honor of working for artists. I've had to dress up for some things. I've had to dress the part for others. Shout out to my colleagues in Paraguay for that one with whatever that is I'm wearing on my head. They were there. There are witnesses. So I've worked, as I said, I've dressed up, I've dressed down, I've worked for law enforcement, and I've walked on the beaches of Chile with justices. I've stood behind secretary generals and behind British royalty. And upon occasion, I've also been in a video or two. Now, throughout this presentation, you will see QR codes primarily down in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. You can use those now, or you can wait until you get a copy of this presentation All of those QR codes will lead you to the source material or for further information on whatever's being presented in that particular slide. Disclaimer. Everything I say today is my opinion alone. It does not represent that of any professional association or any institution I have any affiliation with, and that includes cross-cultural communications. It also includes AIC. And on that note, let's go ahead and get started with our polling feature. That way I can practice it and you guys can as well. I'd like to ask the following question. What is AIC? People seem to still be voting. Again, we have 807 people watching. I'm flabbergasted. Thank you. Thank you for that vote of confidence. Okay. And the results are pretty much in. Professional association, 61%, an accreditation agency, 11, and no clue, 27%. Great, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. AIC is the International Association of Conference Interpreters. It is really the only worldwide association that brings together conference interpreters specifically. It has over 3,000 members worldwide and includes over 60 languages. And that includes signed languages, not just ASL, but we have members from across the globe who work in other assigned languages, including Colombian Sign Language.
Caddy,
Okay.
if I
Yes.
may interrupt you, we
Yes,
are getting
please.
requests if there's a way to make your screen visible to all, because we're getting it's as if it's enlarged in a way so that we can't see the full PowerPoint screen. Is there a
That's
way
very
to adjust?
interesting.
It's very
Let,
strange.
yeah, let me just stop sharing and try it again and see what happens.
To our audience members, as someone who has been training recently on Zoom, I can quite a bit, I can tell you that there's always some interesting new strange thing that Zoom can do to you when you least expect it.
Thank you, Marjorie. Is that any better?
That's, from my view, that's perfect.
Okay. Again,
we'll be monitoring
apologies. Please monitor. Yes, please do interrupt me if there are any other issues.
Thank you.
All right. So a bit of history. I'm just talking about interpretation. Before 1919, and this, we're really only talking about over 100 years ago. So most things, most developments in the interpreting business or industry or the profession have really happened in the last 100 years. If we go back, of course, way back, ancient Egypt, the first real depiction of an interpreter. And then, of course, the business of trade and commerce around the globe for as long as probably there's been trade in human beings, there have been interpreters facilitating the work. Obviously, most of that was in the consecutive mode, and some of it, to a certain extent, was whispering, perhaps chuchotage. But then we see that in 1919, there's really a sea change. At the Paris armistice negotiations, we see a couple of things happening. First of all, we see interpreters working in teams of 2. And we see interpreters working in long consecutive. Now, when I say long consecutive, another poll, how long do you think a long consecutive is? And if I can, there we go, whoops. Well, there seems to be a question missing from our deck. This is not a problem. You've probably think to yourself, how long is long consecutive? 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour, more than an hour? Well, these teams of 2 interpreters at the Paris Armistice negotiations, some people call it the peace conference, were actually working for speeches that lasted over an hour. Talk about long consecutive, okay? Again, down in the right-hand corner, you will see that QR code. And from there, after interpreters were trained to do that long consecutive and perform so well in 1919, we see things changing very quickly. In the 1920s, at a couple of different occasions, we see the beginning of simultaneous interpretation. We see the use of the hush phone. And of course, in 1945, 1947, the Nuremberg trials. Not just one, but a series of trials in which simultaneous interpretation really comes into its own. And that's when we talk about the beginning truly of simultaneous conference interpreting. But what is a conference anyway? According to the International Standards Organization, a conference is a structured formal meeting or a set of meetings that follows an established agenda in which issues, ideas, and policies are discussed. Okay, great. What does that mean for us as interpreters? It means that we'll be performing long consecutive, hopefully not an hour, but pretty long, and simultaneous interpreting. It means that there's a structured event, something that's planned ahead of time. It has a beginning and in theory an end, although we all know as conference interpreters that when you walk into an event, you know what time you're supposed to start, but you're never really sure what time it's going to end. It has a set agenda, and it's an event that flows pretty much without interruption from beginning to end. And we also know that the speakers will be speaking at a fast pace very often, and also reading from prepared documents, formal academic papers on some occasions, or diplomatic speeches that they've worked on for days, in some cases even months, that they read out at a very high speed. In a best case scenario, we'll have access to those documents. In a less auspicious situation, we will not. And this is one of the issues for RSI. Get more information again through on what the ISO and the ISO definition of conference interpreting through the code. So this is what we're normally talking about in a conference setting for simultaneous interpretation, not remote, but on site. So the interpreters are sitting in their booths. You can see that's me there, third person down. And we're overlooking this particular conference room. We have screens in front of us to help us see the speakers more closely because they're pretty far away. But we're sitting there, we're able to see exactly what is happening. That's our traditional on-site conference setting. But let's see what happens if we take a quantum leap forward. What is the situation when we take that conference setting and we now put it in a distance situation, teleconference, or remote? Now, what do I mean by these things? Well, IEC has a set of definitions, again, the International Association of Conference Interpreters, and it goes like this. Distance interpreting can be divided into 2 things. First, teleconference interpreting. The interpreter is on site, like in this image. The interpreters are sitting in their traditional booth overlooking a traditional conference room, and somebody calls in on, say, Skype. If they do that, then everyone is sitting there. You have a direct view of the participants, except for the person who's calling in. That is what we're going to call teleconference interpreting. The second option is remote interpreting per se. And that means that the interpreter is physically at a different location. They can be at a different location, like we can see on the screen, where the interpreter's in one place and you have a multiplicity of screens, or you can simply have the interpreter, everyone meeting in a physical room, and the interpreter is in a separate room. So just to give you the overview of this, we have two forms of distance interpreting. One form of distance interpreting in which you have no direct view of the participants. We're going to call that, according to the IKE definitions, teleconference interpreting. That can be done with video or just audio, but I can specifically see, and I think I misspoke, you can directly see the participants. The other, where I have no direct view of the participants, like me speaking to you today, I don't see most of you. This is remote. If there were interpreters on board, we would have a situation of remote interpreting. It would be video remote interpreting because you can see me, okay, if the interpreters could see me, and it would not be audio remote because, again, there is a video signal. It's probably single screen VRI, video remote interpreting, because I can't see all of you, and the interpreters could not see everyone who is participating. They can't see everyone, they're just seeing me. If you're working at the European Parliament, for example, you would be in a remote situation where you're not sitting in the same room with the delegates, but you would have a hardwired connection and several screens so that you could see what's going on in the conference room, the individual speaker, the general perspective. It's more like being there than a single screen. Okay. Now, I know that many of you have worked in OPI and are experienced interpreters in that area, but I do have a question for you. 1973, the first country to introduce this. It had already been put up, so I'm going to share those results. And so we see 38% believe that OPI was first introduced in the US, 44% in the UK, 7% in India, and 10% in Australia. The answer is Australia. Fairly soon after that, about a decade, the US introduced its first OPI service, and as we know, there's been very rapid growth in that ever since. VRI, the first experiments, came not too long after the first introduction of OPI, but the first really massive rollout doesn't happen until 2010 in the medical field. Again, not surprising. But what about conferences? That definition of these formal meetings that would be using primarily simultaneous interpretation. Well, the first conferences to use remote simultaneous interpreting were these. An experiment in 2003, and the first one, really the biggest rollout, was in 2005 at this wonderful venue in the UK. The reason is it's an older venue, and the interpreters simply did not fit in the room. So accommodations were made and remote was rolled out. Now, just as in the past, when we moved from long consecutive interpreting into simultaneous interpreting, many interpreters were very hesitant. They didn't like the change. The same thing has happened in the move from on-site interpreting to online interpreting, from physical site to remote to distance to teleconference to distance in the remote form. Interpreters feel at a loss. You don't see things. You're not getting all of the sensory input that you would get. It's not like being there. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Why conference interpreters are so reticent to use the existing platforms. Okay, so let's talk about, again, RSI. And let's talk about the platforms that are available and the ways that we've been doing interpreting. First of all, let me ask you this. How many of you have worked from home or from a hub in interpreting? If you don't know what these are, it's fine. You don't have to answer the question. Just out of curiosity, if you know what I mean by working from a hub or from home.
Votes are coming in fast and furious.
They certainly are. We're at 908 participants at this point. 909. Wow. 910.
And about half, more than half have voted.
Yeah. All right. So I think we've got a pretty good sample there. And we can see this. So 85% of you, half of you who were able to vote before I turned the voting off, have worked from home, and 24% have worked from a hub. Now, what exactly do I mean by this? Working from a hub kind of looks like this. You have your traditional interpreting booth. There's probably several booths in place. You don't have a direct view of the participants because it's distance interpreting, but you do have the video feed and you have a technician on site to troubleshoot. So if you forget to turn on your microphone or there's any sort of an audio problem, your traditional technician is right there to step in and help you out, which is really very different from working from home, where you're looking at a screen or two, if you happen to have more than one, and you might have to rig things in a way that's comfortable for you for the appropriate height. It can be quite a challenge. When you're working from home or when you're working on one of these platforms, you'll probably see something like this, where that big video camera is. You would see the participant or the speaker. In this case, you would see me. So let's talk a little bit about another solution. One of those other solutions is this. It's a hybrid. So here we have our colleagues in a COVID-19 world. They're wearing their masks. They are co-located. They're seated together. This is, of course, the best practice for conference interpreting. They're using, as you can see, their traditional simultaneous interpreting equipment, but they're also using a video feed. So in this particular situation, these colleagues in Turkey are at a client's offices. The speakers are distributed and are attending from home and from all over. They're in one room, their technician is in a separate room, and everyone is working in separate spaces to ensure appropriate social distancing. But it's a hybrid solution. So the interpreter is just turning things on, turning things off, and getting their feed in the traditional way, much as if they were physically present, with the only difference here, again, being that they're looking at a screen. Now, of course, there is the question of what kind of sound are they actually receiving? We'll talk about that in a little while as well. So let's talk about these platforms. What are we talking about? Please go ahead and tell me if you have ever interpreted simultaneously on any of these platforms. You might have to scroll down. There are some options at the bottom. Take a couple of minutes just to go through that. Now, I remember that over half of you had said that you had worked from home. So I'm going to assume that you probably used at least one of these platforms. Votes are coming in a little more slowly. I know that there are a whole lot more options here. So we'll just give you another moment to go ahead and look at these options. Again, you can pick more than one, because if you're like me, you have actually worked on more than one platform.
It's actually fascinating, Caddy, to see the spread.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I see that a lot of people are scrolling down to be able to get to that Google Meet, Microsoft Teams, or other, which is important. All right, votes are still coming in, but I think the trend is pretty clear, isn't it, Marjorie?
It sure is, Kenny.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and close that vote then and share the results. And as we can see, we have a clear winner here. 70% of you say that you have voted on Zoom. And I'd say the next biggest chunk have worked on Google Meet, Microsoft Teams, or other. Very few of you have worked on some of the other more formal conference interpreting platforms. And that's fine. Interestingly, 4% of you have worked on Jabber and 19% on WebEx. All right, so let's talk about these platforms. What exactly are we talking about here? When we're talking about remote simultaneous interpreting platforms, we're talking about a number, and this is not an exhaustive list. There are other platforms out there, but these are the ones that folks seem to be most familiar with. Perhaps the exception is WebSwitcher, which is better known in Canada than it is in the US. But certainly in Europe, the biggest players today are Interactio and Interprify. In the US, probably Kudo, Interprify, VoiceBoxer. Again, Canada, WebSwitcher is an important player, and I'll tell you why it's so important and what makes it different when we start talking about features and the technical aspects in just a moment. So what do these platforms have in common? They have a certain set of features that conference interpreters are going to be interested in. And why do we keep talking about conference interpreters? Because it's primarily conference interpreters that are going to be working strictly in the simultaneous mode. When you talk about remote simultaneous interpreting, of course, many of you have worked on Zoom. Many of you have said you've been doing simultaneous on other platforms, but it may or may not have been a conference setting. And again, we'll talk about that in just a minute. I will talk about the elephant in the room. But let's talk about the platforms that are designed for simultaneous conference interpreting. Okay. They have a certain set of features. They have a microphone, a big button that you can turn on and off. You'll have a system for handover from one interpreter to another. Right there on screen, you don't have to be jerry rigging it or being MacGyver and having two sets of headsets or two different devices. Your handover is right there. You'll have the ability to take and give relay. So if I have a Mixteco interpreter working from Mixteco into Spanish, and I'm going from Spanish into English, I can hear my colleague working in the simultaneous mode, and I can then take that relay and work into the simultaneous mode as well. You'll have an interpreting partner chat, not one that you can accidentally send to everybody, which happens, which can sometimes not be a very good thing. And you'll have the option at least for an on-site technician. Some of these platforms are offering it as something that's included in the package, and some of them offer it as an add-on. But there are other platforms, of course, the elephant in the room, that do not offer this option. And there's another important one that not all of these platforms have, and that is the ability to listen to your interpreting partner and be able to hear the floor at the same time. To be able to understand and maintain the consistency in the terminology you're using, to be able to provide support through a chat box. Now, working on it through a chat box to provide terminology is not the same as scribbling it or just mouthing the word so that your colleague sitting next to you can pick up on it and understand what you're trying to say. It's not at all the same. It increases our cognitive load. And again, I'll get to that in just a minute. Some of these platforms, however, have this feature, others do not. And before you ask me, Kudo and WebSwitcher do not have this function. Okay. So when we're talking about the types of features that are required, if there's an ISO standard, it's the bottom of the screen. Unfortunately, these standards are not available to the general public for free. You have to buy them. But they are available, and they're available to your clients should they be interested in learning more about it. Now, there are other platforms, and some of you had said that you had worked, for example, on ZipDX. ZipDX is a great platform. but it's not a full-fledged video conferencing platform in the way that the others offer it. It doesn't have all of the bells and whistles, for example, of Zoom, but it does have fabulous, fabulous conference interpreting systems in place. You can hear, you can do this, you can change your audio. It's probably the most complete of any of the platforms from the interpreter's perspective, but as a general rule from our client's perspective, because it's primarily teleconference audio based, it's not as attractive as a solution. All right, so I said the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is, of course, Zoom. We have our features on the left that are the ones that we have on our RSI platforms, the ones that we're used to having as conference interpreters when working in the simultaneous mode. What does Zoom offer us? Zoom offers us the possibility to switch back and forth from one channel to another, and it offers us an interpreting partner chat. Now, I've added a question mark there because it's really easy in Zoom to hit the wrong chat. So I'm guessing some of you by accident have sent a message in the chat or to the Q&A just to the panelists instead of to everyone. Imagine doing that to all of the participants and not just your interpreting partner. So the feature is there, but it's a little dangerous. Okay? But it doesn't have any of these other things. Now, it doesn't have that today. It doesn't mean it won't have it in the future. But for today, Zoom is a video conferencing platform with a simultaneous interpreting add-on. Okay, it's not a remote simultaneous interpreting platform. All right. Now, I've talked about how interpreters in the past were hesitant to move from consecutive to simultaneous, and how interpreters from the conference world have been hesitant to move from the physical world to the online world. And here's part of the reason why. In addition to not being able to get input, the visual input from seeing how people are reacting. If someone tells a joke and I give inflection in my voice to that joke, it's not necessarily clear to me whether you guys are laughing. I can't see you. That's going to affect my ability to continue to perform in the way I'm going to adjust my speaking as an interpreter. But there are other technical aspects as well. Now, I know there are a lot of numbers on the screen, and most of you have just probably completely blanked out and went, yeah, I'm an interpreter. That's not my shtick. Okay? We're going to give you the results of a test. Now, this is a single test. It was done by the IEC Technical and Health Committee, and they looked at some of the platforms, and they looked at actually 6 platforms, but I'm only going to show you the results for the ones that were that we've been talking about here. So there's a lot of green here. There's a lot of things that these platforms actually do very well. But for frequency and spectrum and the hearing protection, if you remember, I said that there was something about the acoustic shock. There was something unique about WebSwitcher. WebSwitcher is the only platform that advertises acoustic shock protection, both sharp noises and continuing noise. So that's what makes WebSwitcher a little different and makes it stand out from the rest of these platforms. Again, we see a lot of green, but in frequency and spectrum, there are issues. All right, great. Well, what does that mean for me as an interpreter? Okay, and I'm going to ask Marjorie to make sure that everybody can hear this when I play it. I'm going to give you just 1-minute clip. This was prepared by some colleagues about 5 years ago, long before these platforms really, I can't even say that they've come into their own, because they were really pretty much in the almost experimental and developmental stage, at least for working from, certainly from working from home, or even in some cases working from a hub. But with the COVID-19 crisis, they've really had to up their game. But I want you to hear the difference in audio quality. And this is important, not just in terms of the quality of the audio we get over the platforms, but also the original that we get from speakers.
Hamlet is the new man of the Renaissance in opposition to the old feudalism, governed by political expediency and by military force. He's an aristocrat who's rebelled against his background by going to a forward-thinking foreign university, by making friends with...
Now remember, the ISO standard is this. This is the one that the platforms have to meet, not the original recording, this level.
...commoners, by falling in love with a politician's daughter, and by hanging around with actors. Hamlet's been dominated by his late father, a notoriously tough soldier, and his father's ghost obliges him, a killer for his father. As a man, Hamlet is everything that the world of politics and soldiering isn't. He's vulnerable, imaginative, sensitive, and he's half mad with grief. Until Hamlet leaves for England after his murder of Polonius, he's on a reckless helter-skelter, swerving between reason and chaos. When he returns from England, he's changed, aged, matured, reconciled somehow to his end. He's cauterized his feelings. He's become a soldier.
So I think that's pretty clear, isn't it? The difference in audio, it's much harder. What we always say, what we can't hear, we can't interpret. But even if you can hear it, the quality of what you're able to hear will impact your ability to produce. And obviously, it's a two-way street. What the interpreter's producing, if you don't have a proper headset, if you're not using a good microphone, what whoever's listening to you will be hearing will sound like that. If they're calling in on a cell phone or using a speakerphone, what you're going to be getting is going to sound like that, even if the platform is able to produce and to transmit in the context of the ISO standard, which in the IEC tests, they actually were not. Now, Zoom was not tested, of course, but this is one of the issues for the conference interpreters, and one of the reasons why conference interpreters are so concerned about being able to perform effectively in a remote simultaneous interpreting situation as compared to being on site. So what are some of these concerns? I said it before, and I'll say it again. Cognitive load. You have to do more things. You have to click here, you have to watch this, you're looking at this, you're looking at the other, you're dealing with the audio, you're dealing with video. There's more stuff going on, and that means more cognitive load. It's more work for your brain. There's Zoom gloom. Staring at the screen all day. We've all been there. There's a question of boothmate distancing. As I said before, of not having my colleague there to scribble something down, to be able to mouth a word at me, to give me an idea. I'm stumbling, it's coming, I'm thinking it's not quite coming. Boom, and my colleague gives me a visual cue that helps me to move forward. I have to type it out. That's another task. I have to type it, I have to read it, I have to be watching the original, I have to be thinking about what I'm saying, I have to be hearing, and I have to be reading the chat. Cognitive load. We saw the audio quality, and when you get a copy of this, you will get a link to the original of that recording that is on Vimeo. We have, as I said, video quality issues. Pixelation, blurry image, people on Wi-Fi from Lord knows where, right? We have picture lag, lip sync, being able to hear and to watch and see what a person's mouth is doing while you're interpreting is very important. We have the question of acoustic shock. As I mentioned, there's one platform that has protection. There are systems that you can add on that aren't perfect that help reduce acoustic shock. And if you think I'm overstating it, this is a report from out of Canada with regard to the Canadian Parliament that was published just last week, May 6th. We're getting too close to our worst case scenario because of a spike in interpreter injuries due to the Parliament meeting virtually. One of the things that the Parliament has done now is to bring the interpreters back on site. So all of the delegates are reporting in remotely, but the interpreters are on site. Again, that's great. The interpreters are going to have fabulous equipment. We're going to be able to produce, and I say we in the generic sense of interpreters, we'll be able to produce fabulous sound quality. But what about that incoming? What are people using? We have the question, as I said, of access to documents. Sometimes we get them, sometimes we don't. But how do I manage those? I'm seeing my speaker, I've got my documents. Do I have to have 2 screens at home to be able to do this, or 3 or more? How do I manage those documents? And of course, there are contractual issues. Interruption of service. Whose fault is it if my internet drops? The question of streaming. This presentation is being recorded. I authorize that. But interpreters, according to international treaty, WIPO, have the copyright. We have our copyright to our version, to our production. If it's being recorded, if it's being streamed, we have to authorize that. And this is something that's really not taken into consideration very often. And there's a question of data confidentiality. Mine, yours, everyone's. If there's a Zoom bomber or whatever it may be, we have to worry about data confidentiality in a way that we don't have to worry about when we're physically on site. Okay, so where does that leave us? What is our status and what does the future hold? Our status right now is this. AIC has produced a very extensive, exhaustive interpreter checklist for performing remote interpreting assignments from home in extremis during the COVID-19 pandemic. The checklist will walk you through many of the things that I just mentioned, the concerns, the contractual conditions. So if you need to do this and you're going to do it with a client, take a look at the checklist and sort of say, okay, I covered this, I covered this, I covered that. And that's fine. And that'll be helpful now. And it's helpful if you're working in the future from a hub. But what does the future hold? Now, this gentleman's crystal ball appears to be in perfect shape. And I'll be honest, mine isn't. But what I do envision and what I do see in my crystal ball is this. Remote simultaneous interpreting is here to stay. Remote simultaneous interpreting platforms are here to stay. The functionalities that I was discussing, the features, will improve. I fully expect Zoom or its competition to roll out more features that will make it easier to do remote simultaneous interpreting on a platform like Zoom. To be able to hear your interpreting partner, to be able to take and give relay, to have multiple languages going on, to make it a video conferencing platform that is also a remote simultaneous interpreting platform. And the other remote simultaneous interpreting platforms will also be upping their game. There's no question about it. Now, what will the future look like in terms of how the market will play out? How much will be remote? How much of the future market will be back on site? That's as far as my crystal ball goes. I don't know. And I don't think anyone knows. The question is, how eager are people to get back into that conference room? And for some markets and for some areas, there's going to be a lot of interest. There, at a traditional, say, UN level conference, a lot of conversations happen in the hallways. A lot of things happen during the coffee breaks. Some things even happen during conversations during happy hour. The human interaction is a very important feature of the way we talk and the way precisely that we interact. People are going to want to come back together. I want to see all of you, 907, 8, I don't know how many we're at this point, 937 participants. I want to see all of your faces. I want to see how you're reacting. I want to be there with you. And I think the vast majority of conferences will eventually come back and be on site because of that. So that concludes the formal part of this presentation. I look forward to your questions. I thank you all 940 of you at this point for being here. I want to thank AIC Technical and Health Committee everyone in IEC pretty much is a volunteer, and the work and the effort that the Technical and Health Committee has done to produce these checklists, to do these studies and research in the past is absolutely phenomenal. And I also want to thank my colleague from IEC USA, Kirill Flerov, for his invaluable support in helping me prepare this presentation, for his guidance, and for his knowledge. He's a wonderful, wonderful colleague and a wonderful, wonderful man. So thank you very much. I will turn the floor back over to Marjorie and open up for Q&A. And I really look forward to your thoughts and your questions. So thank you.
Well, Katty, eternal thanks. That was an incredibly huge gift you just gave to the interpreting community, very seriously. And yes, I will not waste time now because we have tons of questions and will, as usual, not be able to get to all of them. But I do want to get a good start. We actually had one arrive just before the webinar, and it's this. Some vendors seem to recommend Intel Core i7 processor for RSI interpreting. In your opinion, is it a must to use i7 or is i5 acceptable for some of the assignments? You may have to explain this issue because most of us don't know.
Don't know what was that question? Okay.
Yeah.
It has to do with the hardware and how advanced and how fast the processor is on your computer.
Thank you.
And the answer is, it depends. It's going to depend on your platform. It's going to depend on the actual make and model of your computer. It's going to depend on the make and model of your headsets and a series of other factors. I have an i5 and I have not had any issues with it on any of the platforms that I have worked on. It has been absolutely sufficient. My experience, and again, speaking just from personal experience and from conversations with colleagues, is that there are certain brands of computers that seem to have more trouble working with certain platforms and with certain headsets. I'm not going to name them. The information is out there. You can Google it. And actually, Naomi Bowman wrote a very good piece on her LinkedIn the other day, talking primarily about headsets, but also she addresses the i5 versus i7 issue as well and talks about the specific platforms that there have been issues with. So the answer is, it depends. In general, my experience is that an i5 is sufficient.
Super. Thank you, Katty. Well, speaking of headphones that you just mentioned, we had two questions about that. And one is straight to the point. What headphones is Katty using? Sounds amazing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm really glad to hear that. This is an older model. It is a Logitech. It is I believe it's a 340H. They are no longer being produced. They're off the market. There are more recent models. I've heard people have had really good success with the newer version, which I believe is the H390. But this is, it's an older model, and I've been very happy with it. And I actually have two. I always recommend that people have an extra headset, and I went out and got the same one. So thank you. I'm glad it sounds good.
But there's a recommendation that you probably don't hear often enough. Have a second headset. Excellent. Another question, were you saying that Zoom does not allow to hear the booth partner and the floor at the same time, or that it does, but the volume is not adjustable? Question of clarification.
Absolutely. As an interpreter, you cannot on Zoom hear your booth mate, period. Okay. The difference is that Zoom, interestingly, has a feature whereby a participant can hear the interpreter and the floor at the same time. So a participant, somebody who's logged in to hear the interpretation, can hear the interpreter and the floor. But you as the interpreter cannot hear the interpreter, your colleague, and the floor at the same time.
Thank you. This question came up more than once. How do we use those QR codes she's posting?
Okay, so if you have a smartphone, you probably have a QR reader app. And if you don't, go to whatever store it is that you need. You can easily download a QR reader for free. And all you do is you take your phone and you point it at that QR code, you point it at the screen, and it will pop up. And depending on the exact application that you're using, it'll say probably something like open web, and it will open up that website and lead you directly to that information.
And just to clarify to everyone who doesn't know it yet, within 24 hours after the end of the webinar, approximately, you will receive a link to the recording of this webinar, but also to the PDF of Caddy's PowerPoint, which he is graciously sharing with you. So then you will be able to use your smartphone for the QR codes.
Yes, yes.
Another question. Caddy, have you used or heard of Doxy.me as a platform being used for interpreting?
I have not. So whoever asked that question, please, Marjorie, take note of who that is, send me the information, and I will investigate it.
And if I can't find that out, if you don't get a response to the person who posed that question, simply email us and we'll make sure that Caddy gets the question.
Okay.
But we will do our best. A couple of questions from court interpreters about working with N95 masks. One is reporting it was not comfortable to speak, and another is asking how are they speaking with their masks on, and if they're taking them off, well then, what about social distancing? So that I don't know, since you're primarily in conference, if you want to tackle that one or not.
Sure. I know that there is on-site interpreting that is happening, and there's a number of different things that are going on, especially in court in the US. And as you saw in the photograph, our colleagues from Turkey are working in a conference setting with their mask on. It is incredibly uncomfortable to interpret with a mask on. However, if you are going to co-locate, if you are going to be within a distance of other people that is wherever you are is within the the distance that's recommended that you wear a mask, all I can say is wear a mask.
Yes, that's a tough one, I'm afraid. This is kind of interesting. It says, how did you come up? And it's obviously not you personally, Caddy, but you as the field. How did you come up with the name RSI? So many variations to remote/virtual interpreting. That's a long question embedded in there.
That is a long question. And, I think you'd have to ask the marketing people behind these platforms. I think the logical way to have labeled this would have been remote conference interpreting. But again, conferences can be either in the consecutive mode or in the simultaneous mode. Now, most conferences today are considered, or congresses or meetings are done in the simultaneous mode. So perhaps it was that people are more familiar with simultaneous interpretation. It could have been worse. They could have called it remote simultaneous translation.
God forbid. Thank you. When you are working in a distant conference with other interpreters by your side, how do you manage isolating the sounds and be able to focus on the conference?
I'm not sure I understand the question. When you're working remotely, how do you isolate the sounds?
Yes, I'm reporting verbatim and I can't read the mind of the questioner. It does
Could you
sound
repeat it?
with pleasure. When you are working in a distant conference, presumably remote conference with other, well, maybe not, with other interpreters by your side, how do you manage isolating the sounds and be able to focus on the conference? So you might want to revisit how it works.
Sure. So we have several options. In a traditional setting, I would be in an interpreting booth. I would have my sound, I would be isolated in terms of my sound acoustically, and I have my interpreting partner sitting next to me. my interpreting partner is going to be quiet while I'm interpreting. They're not talking on the phone. They're not answering their emails on the computer, banging away. The person sitting next to me is quiet. They're supportive. They're listening to what is the incoming sound. They're listening to what I'm saying, and they're supporting me by writing things down. Dates, numbers, times, places, things that are going to be difficult for me in the simultaneous mode. If I'm working in a hybrid situation or in a hub, as we saw in these photographs, same thing applies. Anytime I have my interpreting partner sitting next to me, my partner is going to be quiet. Now, how do I prepare to work remotely, to work from home? Well, obviously, I'm going to need a space that is very quiet. I'm going to go ahead and take down my screen so you can actually see where I'm sitting. Okay, so this is my home office. Okay, full confession here. This is my home office, and I have sound absorbent panels behind me in the picture, and I have sound absorbing panels in front of me as well. I have my door closed. I have everything as quiet as I can possibly get it. This is very important for conference interpreting and for any remote simultaneous. And it's one of the huge challenges today because not everybody has the luxury of having an installation like I do. Many people are trying to work at home. We saw that photo of a colleague where he's got his, computer sitting on a plastic box and a separate microphone. It's a really tough ask to get for people to be able to work in ideal conditions from home. And it's another reason why things will probably eventually go back to being on site. Not everybody has this possibility.
Thank you. A question you alluded to earlier that in some ways the logical name for RSI would have been remote conference interpreting, RCI, if you will. But this is a question that came up: is RSI only for conferences?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? Because of the functionality on Zoom, you can do simultaneous interpreting over Zoom for a court hearing, which is technically not a conference according to the definition that we saw. So the simultaneous mode is used in more than just conferences. Now, the question is, do we use a complete remote simultaneous interpreting platform, or do we use a video conferencing platform with a simultaneous add-on? That's the question, and it's going to depend on the circumstances and, quite honestly, on your budget.
Absolutely. There's going to be a short answer to this one, probably a firm one. Caddy's interpreting on the Zoom platform possible by just computer audio without additional headset?
No.
That was a bit less firm than I was expecting.
Is it physically possible? Of course. But it goes back to the question of sound quality, what you're getting in and what is going out. So is it physically possible? Sure. Should you do it? And here's the firm answer: no.
Who decides what RSI software to use?
Usually your client. I mean, again, this will depend. In some cases, I have had clients come to me and say, help, we have a conference scheduled, we can't do it physically, what do you recommend? And I will sit virtually down with them and say, okay, this is what you have, these are the options, these are the needs, and I'm acting as a consultant interpreter. I'm really almost as a consultant, as an RSI consultant, rather than just an interpreter. And that's why it's so important that we all understand what the options are and how the platforms work so that we can provide that service to our clients. Look, your best option for this is this or that. So I can do that in some cases, and in others, if you're working for the UN, the European Union, the Organization of American States, many of these international organizations, they've already made their decision, they already have their contracts in place, and they're going to tell you what platform you're using. So again, it's going to depend.
Sure. Here's one I must confess I'm ignorant about. Would you please speak to the risk of acoustic shock with RSI? Wow.
Right. So that is actually something that I mentioned briefly in the presentation. And it's one of the concerns, interpreter injury in the Canadian Parliament. And when they talk about injury, they're referring to acoustic shock. Acoustic shock can come fundamentally, and I don't want to get into the decibels. This is the numbers. I mean, I could put the presentation back up and show some of those. But the important thing is this: there are two real ways that you can get acoustic shock. One is by a really, really loud spike. So if I were to take my headset off and slam it on my desk, that might not produce a level of sound that would create an injury, a permanent hearing loss to you, or other types of hearing related injury, because it's not just hearing loss, but it could. The other is a constant exposure to a certain level of sound that can also produce acoustic shock. Now, this is not something that is exclusive to remote simultaneous situations. This is something that can happen on site as well. There are limiters. There are some headphones, there's some Sennheisers that actually include a limiter. It's not going to completely eliminate your risk, but there are some systems that are available either physically on the headsets or externally that can be used. Again, if you look at the IKE checklist, you will see that there are specific references there and the specific information as to what the definition of acoustic shock, what the range needs to be. You can then use that information to look at the label on the headset that you're thinking about buying, or whether you decide to go with one headset and a separate microphone. There are lots of options. It doesn't have to be a boom mic, but it does have to be a mic that's unidirectional, that's not going to pick up everything around you. It's only going to pick up the sound of your voice.
Well, we didn't come to an end of the questions, Kathy, but we have come to the end. Let me put on my video so I can thank you in person, so to speak. That was a remarkable tour of the field. I really feel like for this series, what you've done is you've given us what I like to call a bulletin board in our minds of the profession that stands behind RSI, the conference interpreting profession, and laid the groundwork for the three webinars that are going to follow, which hone in on more specific areas. And it was extremely clear, to the point, incredibly informative in such a short time. We cannot thank you enough. We are deeply grateful to you.
And I look forward to listening to attending the other three as a participant. I'm really looking forward to your speakers. You have a great lineup, and I'm looking forward to hearing them and learning from what they have to share as well.
And to our audience, it was because she was listening to the VRI, and I apparently mentioned we've been getting so many questions about RSI that it was like we were going to have to do a series, but we're looking for speakers, that she volunteered. She stepped up and came to us, and that was very endearing of you, given your stature in the field. So thank you again, Kathy. We're going to let you off the hook, but as always with these webinars, I stay on to answer questions about CCC or programs or general things, not RSI, because I am not in any way knowledgeable about RSI, but I will stay on. Meantime, we will bid a very, very fond temporary farewell to you. We will certainly be in touch. Thank you again.
Thank you everyone, and thank you to everyone who joined in today. I'm overwhelmed by the response. It's really been a pleasure, and thank you, Marjorie, and to CCC for having me. I'm honored. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care and enjoy the rest of your day. It's a well-earned day of hopefully peace and pleasure.